spring, 1945. The frost had only just loosened its grip on the soil when a U.S. infantry column halted at the edge of a battered field outside a nameless German village. The farmhouse beside them stood half-collapsed, roof charred, windows blown wide. Yet what stopped the convoy wasn't the ruin, nor the risk of snipers still rumored to prowl these outskirts. It was the grave. Fresh earth, darker than the field around it, had been turned by hand. No military symmetry, no headstone, just a crude wooden stake driven into the ground with more reverence than skill. The marker leaned slightly, as if bowing to the silence it demanded. No one spoke. One by one, the soldiers removed their helmets. Not in salute of rank, or flag, or fallen brother, but something else entirely. Wind moved across the wheat, stubble like breath. The artillery in the east had not ceased. Not fully. Its distant thunder reminded them that the war had not ended. Not yet. But here, for a moment, it had paused. The grave bore a name. Not American. Not human. Letters etched by a combat knife, tentative, uneven into the side of a splintered plank. A name that should not have been honored in this way, not by regulation, but still they stood. Some of the younger men shuffled awkwardly, unsure whether this gesture would be condemned or forgotten. Others stared, hollow-eyed, weighed down by months of carnage. The moral lines had blurred long ago. Here, in the mud of a foreign field, one more had disappeared. What was it then that they were burying? Pity? Guilt? Respect? The records would never say. But years later, one soldier would recall only this: "We didn't know if it was right, but it felt human." And just beyond the broken hedgerow, another unit was about to make a discovery that would render that small act of grace almost incomprehensible. By 1945, the American infantry had forgotten the full rites of mourning. There had been too many burials, too few chaplains, and never enough time. The fields of Europe had taken friends, commanders, replacements who'd arrived one day and vanished the next. The war taught them how to grieve quickly, or not at all. They had become experts in emotional economy, in the mud of Normandy, in the forests near Hirtgen, in frozen Belgian crossroads with names they never learned. They rationed sorrow like ammunition. It was how they survived. The living learned to look past the dead. To hesitate was to risk joining them. German civilians were rarely seen, and when they were rarely trusted. German soldiers, even in death, remained enemies. Their bodies were sometimes buried, more often left where they fell cold warnings to those still fighting. Military funerals, when conducted at all, were brief, standardized. A prayer, a salute, a name etched into dog tags, then back to the march. By that point in the war, compassion had become a kind of liability. The men had learned to guard their instincts as tightly as their rations. Sympathy could be fatal, not in theory, but in practice. The soldier who lingered too long, who offered too much, often didn't come back. That was the arithmetic of attrition. So the idea of honoring anything German, let alone pausing for it, bordered on unthinkable. The war had hollowed out such gestures, not by command, but by erosion, a slow wearing down of what once defined them. And yet, here stood these men, helmets at their sides, boots planted in soft earth, beside a grave that no regulation had required. No order had been given. None was needed. What they violated wasn't protocol, it was expectation. It would never be entered into any report, never formally acknowledged. But it marked something real, a brief rupture in the machinery of war, when instinct overcame ideology. And miles to the south, another patrol would soon stumble upon what looked like a supply crate until they broke it open and saw what was inside. He appeared without warning. No bark, no whimper, no noise at all. Just the quiet thud of paws on churned soil. The soldiers had stopped to regroup outside a railway station recently taken in the advance, half-bombed, still smoldering. And through the smoke, from the edge of the rubble, came the dog. He had no collar, no leash, no markings of ownership, no uniformed handler, no patch denoting rank. If he had once belonged to someone, that story had ended elsewhere. What remained was a lean, mottled creature, with the solemn stillness of something that had already seen too much. The men assumed he would leave. Most animals did, frightened off by engines, by shouting, by the scent of oil and gunpowder, or else they were starving, desperate, and gone again within moments. But this one stayed. He didn't beg. He didn't flinch. He simply sat down near the edge of the squad's perimeter and watched, head tilted slightly, eyes unblinking. There was no effort to claim him, nor any vote to keep him. No one gave orders. The war rarely allowed for additions, only losses. Yet he remained, present at morning roll call, silent during artillery shelling, trotting behind the medics, resting under the trucks at nightfall. It became impossible to remember when exactly he'd stopped being a visitor. He was not a mascot. That word implies decoration, or morale, or theater. This was something else, something quieter. He offered nothing but proximity. In return, he demanded nothing. No games, no affection, only presence. And somehow, that was enough. It was said, later, that he never barked. Not once. That even in the chaos of retreat or the thunder of a barrage, he moved with a kind of internal compass, sensing where to be and who needed him near. The men didn't name him. Naming things was a habit for safer places. In a world where everything was assigned, categorized, and worn down by order, the dog entered without reason and remained without need of one. But outside Dresden, that quiet logic would be tested when the first bullet didn't miss. In war, sentiment was rationed more tightly than food. Military doctrine discouraged emotional attachment not out of cruelty, but necessity. Relationships were liabilities. Bonds slowed movement. Grief clouded judgment. Soldiers were trained to think in terms of units, not individuals. Loss was a number, not a feeling. This included animals. If dogs appeared in a war zone, it was usually by design. They served as scouts, messengers, or detectors moving through minefields, sniffing for traps, guiding medics. Their purpose was tactical. Their training was rigid. A war dog was a weapon with a heartbeat. To American troops in 1945, dogs had another meaning as well, one shaped by enemy lines. German shepherds were symbols of the Wehrmacht. They were seen alongside SS patrols, at barbed wire checkpoints, in propaganda reels, and prisoner camps. To many Allied soldiers, the silhouette of a dog was a trigger for caution, not comfort. So when the uninvited dog began shadowing the infantry unit outside Dresden, it registered first as a curiosity and then as a contradiction. He was untrained, untagged, unclaimed. He responded to no commands and bore no signs of military use. He was neither feral nor tamed. He simply was. And despite everything they had been taught, the soldiers let him stay. Their training had emphasized suspicion over sentiment. The war had sharpened that instinct. And yet, as the days passed, it became harder to apply the same logic to the dog. He didn't behave like a tool. He wasn't obedient, nor particularly helpful. He didn't sniff for landmines or deliver messages. He simply followed and watched. Most of the men had long since buried whatever softness they'd carried into Europe. Some had watched their brothers die in Normandy. Others had dug graves outside Bastogne, frozen fingers clawing at frostbitten soil. By now, they understood the rules. Don't get close. Don't get attached. Don't name things. You'll lose. But the dog made no demands. He asked for nothing, offered no guarantees, and that made him harder to ignore. Because he wasn't a mascot. He wasn't a distraction. He was something worse, a mirror. A reminder that not everything in war could be explained by doctrine or rank. At first, they joked that he was testing discipline, but somewhere beneath the laughter was the quiet admission that he already had. He wasn't supposed to mean anything. And yet when he limped after the convoy that morning, injured, dust-covered, and still trying to keep pace, something shifted. No one said it aloud, but a few men slowed their march. And miles ahead, the terrain was changing. A crossroads, a sniper's nest, and a decision no soldier wanted to make. All waited in silence. They tried the usual commands, first simple English words, spoken with the flat tone soldiers used for mules and supply dogs. Stay, come, back. But the animal gave no response. Not confusion, not fear, just stillness. As if language had never been a part of his world. He didn't flinch at the sight of American uniforms. Didn't startle at the slam of a truck door or the metallic snap of a rifle bolt. He moved with the rhythm of the unit, but not by instruction. There was no training evident, no pattern of reward. He followed without obedience, lingered without begging. There was no transaction in his presence. At first, the men assumed he had belonged to someone, perhaps a German patrol, a local farmer conscripted into defense, or even a fleeing officer. It would have made sense. Dogs had been used across both sides of the war for years, bred, trained, assigned. If he had a role, it was long since discarded. If he had a master, that tie had been broken. They searched, informally, checked his ears for tags, looked for burns, branding, or signs of military use. Nothing. No insignia, no collar, no scars that suggested handlers or leashes. He was a presence without paperwork, a creature without origin. And that unsettled them in ways they rarely admitted aloud. In a war built on categories, friend or enemy, soldier or civilian, asset or threat, the dog resisted placement. His past remained sealed, without a name, a language, or allegiance. He existed outside the framework they had been taught to trust. That ambiguity made him harder to ignore. If he had barked German commands, they could have kept their distance. If he had worn a tag or shown fear, they might have known what to make of him. But he offered no such clarity. And so, for the first time, the enemy was not a man or a machine, but a question. One that moved beside them, slept near their boots, and watched their faces as they changed in the firelight. In a different time, they might have left him behind, or shot him. But this was the end of the war, and they were tired of certainty. He became a kind of unspoken test, not of loyalty, but of something deeper, their ability to withhold judgment when judgment had become their only habit. And the longer he remained, the less it mattered what he had once been. But the silence he carried would not last. In the hills ahead, a shot would ring out, and the mystery they had tolerated would demand a response. There is a belief common to soldiers not taught in manuals, but absorbed through repetition and loss, that war simplifies things. That once the shooting starts, decisions narrow. The field divides into binaries: advance or retreat, live or die, friend or foe. In war, they are told, morality must be efficient. It is a comfort disguised as discipline. When everything outside the wire is coded as enemy, hesitation is not required. Judgment becomes reaction. Orders become instinct. There is no room for complexity. And that, in its own way, makes survival easier. This belief had carried them through the hedgerows of France and the frozen outskirts of Bastogne. It had helped them fire into tree lines without confirmation. It had helped them ignore bodies in shallow ditches. The war, after all, did not wait for nuance. Complexity, they were told, was a civilian luxury, but the dog did not fit the equation. He offered no allegiance, wore no side. He did not resist, but neither did he surrender. He simply existed beside them, among them, without asking permission or giving explanation. In his silence, there was no challenge, and yet, for many, it felt like one. He did not behave like a symbol, and so he couldn't be dismissed as one. He did not console, so he could not be blamed for sentiment. He asked for nothing, gave no assurances, and seemed to carry no judgment of what he saw. And still, he was there, at the edge of each formation, beneath the trucks at night, moving with them without ever truly joining. And so, slowly, the men began to feel the pressure of something they couldn't name. It wasn't guilt. They had seen too much for that. It wasn't affection. They had buried too many to allow for it. It was something else, an awareness that their logic, the logic that made war survivable, might be incomplete. Because if a creature could exist without side, without command, without purpose, and still matter, then perhaps the lines weren't as fixed as they'd believed. Perhaps the enemy was not always who they expected. Perhaps survival required more than obedience. Most didn't speak of it, not directly. But they noticed when he bled, they noticed when he limped, and when he lay motionless one morning after an ambush. A few stared too long. The equation had shifted, and they didn't know what to do with the remainder. Later, someone retrieved a length of cloth from a supply truck. It wasn't a bandage, but it was wrapped gently and tied in silence. And just ahead in the next village, behind a cellar door, a decision would wait that no training had prepared them for. By late March, the dog was no longer an interruption. He was part of the rhythm. The unit moved, and he moved with them, one pace behind or alongside, never ahead, never in the way. No one had assigned him a role, but one had emerged nonetheless. Not official, not spoken, just understood. He slept near the sentries, often curled beneath the base of a sandbag wall. He showed no fear of gunfire. Shells could land within yards, and he would flinch but not flee. The men noticed. noticed how he remained when others ran, how his ears moved faster than theirs when something shifted in the dark. He followed patrols through wooded ridges and bombed-out roads, always at a distance. Never so close that he disrupted orders, never so far that he disappeared. There were moments when he vanished for hours, and yet, by dusk, he returned coat dirty, paws cut, eyes scanning the line until he found the men again. They began sharing rations, but without discussion. It wasn't charity, it was reflex. A slice of bread set near a footlocker, a strip of jerky dropped and not retrieved. No ceremony, no ownership. When food was short, they still gave him some, not out of pity but out of pattern. He had become one of them, and hunger didn't rank by species. Still, no one named him. Not formally. Some called him the Shadow, others just whistled low when they wanted him near. Names, they'd learned, made things harder to bury, easier to miss. The men were already carrying too many names they couldn't speak aloud. What made him different wasn't loyalty, it was instinct. He reacted to danger before they did, before tripwires were visible, before the air changed, before the first shot. It wasn't dramatic, just a tension in his shoulders, a shift in how he stood, a long pause, like breath held in the trees. More than once, that pause saved lives. Suspicion had given way to usefulness. What had once been tolerated was now protected. No one said it out loud, but if a truck rolled too fast, or if a new officer gave orders that put the dog at risk, men hesitated. Men argued. That, too, went unspoken. He wasn't a mascot, wasn't a pet. He was the only thing in their lives not issued by supply or sanctioned by command. He asked nothing, spoke nothing, judged nothing, and in return, he became something war rarely allowed, a presence that didn't take, but gave. But the days were changing. The front had pushed east, and German resistance had fractured more desperate, more unpredictable. Towns that looked abandoned weren't. Civilians were still inside. Traps had been left behind. Orders grew sharper, patrols longer. Suspicion returned, not toward the dog, but toward everything else. And on the morning they entered the next village, the one with no name on the map, the dog halted at a doorway. A wooden cellar entrance, broken lock, blood in the soil. The men raised their rifles, but the dog didn't move. What lay beneath that door would not be a question. It would be a choice. The Second World War was, above all, a war of machines. Mechanized columns stretched across continents. Radios hummed with encrypted orders. Tanks rolled forward in grids. Artillery was mapped by degrees and coordinates. Progress was measured not just in miles, but in signal strength, fuel consumption, and logistics timetables. But even among this iron landscape, the system failed more often than it admitted. Radios went silent. Wires were cut. Batteries froze. Maps, printed just days earlier, became obsolete by nightfall. Towns listed as intact were rubble. Bridges marked passable were already gone. The machine, for all its noise and logic, lost track of itself in the fog. And then there was the dog. He carried no equipment, no training manual. He didn't know the shape of a mine or the arc of a howitzer. But when the air thickened, when something unseen shifted in the rhythm of the trees, he stopped. Looked. Waited. Twice. He paused just seconds before an incoming barrage, moments before the horizon broke open in light. The men began to notice. Not all at once, and not with ceremony. But gradually, behavior changed. Rifles lowered when he relaxed. Tension rose when his ears turned sharply toward nothing. It wasn't strategy. It wasn't even belief. It was repetition, a pattern too consistent to ignore. No one asked permission. No one briefed it in orders. But the trust formed anyway. Not formal, not public, just action. When he moved faster, they moved faster. When he hesitated, they scanned the ridge. Some called it coincidence. Others didn't call it anything. But the outcome was the same. They followed. This wasn't the kind of trust armies were built to encourage. Command was meant to flow from ranks, from experience, from training, not from an animal who had never saluted a flag, and yet no one stopped it, not because they were sentimental, but because it worked. It didn't replace doctrine. It rewrote a small part of it quietly, without debate. It added something that couldn't be measured in codebooks or coordinates, something the manuals left out. In the old war games, innovation meant faster tanks, sharper scopes, encrypted channels. But here, the innovation wasn't mechanical. It was moral. It was the willingness, however small, however temporary, to trust something outside the structure, something that didn't speak, didn't rank, and didn't belong. And in this way, the dog became more than a presence. He became a breach in the machinery, a soft interruption in the hard language of war. He reminded them, not with reason, but with instinct, that not all knowledge wore a uniform. In the final months, as command fractured and front lines shifted hourly, the dog remained unassigned, unaccounted for, but never uninvolved. The men watched him more closely than they watched the maps, not because he always knew, but because, increasingly, he knew before they did. And on the day the battalion reached the bridge, the one they were told was clear, the one no scout had reached, the dog stopped short, refused to cross. No mine was marked, no enemy flagged, but the men froze anyway. What they found beneath the timbers changed the mission, and the silence that followed changed something else. It was supposed to be a routine movement, a small shift east to secure a bridge already marked as cleared. No resistance was expected. The orders were simple. Recon the far side, radio back, hold position until armored support arrived. The terrain was open, the weather cold but clear. Just another village, just another mile. They moved at standard intervals, silent, practiced, watchful. Houses on either side lay hollowed by earlier shelling. Smoke still drifted from collapsed chimneys. A broken cart leaned against a stone wall. And then, without warning, the first shots cracked the air. The origin was uncertain. A side window? A cellar? Somewhere high? Somewhere close? Automatic fire followed in bursts, short, controlled, too well timed to be undisciplined. The men scattered. Some dove behind crumbling walls. Others dropped to the mud. Radios shouted static. A command was issued, then cut off halfway through. It was not a trap. It was an error, a failure in mapping, in timing, in certainty. Amid the confusion, the dog did not retreat. He ran forward. No command was given. No one called. And yet he broke from the perimeter and sprinted into the open through the smoke, across the line of fire. At first, it made no sense. Maybe he panicked. Maybe the noise overwhelmed his instincts. Or maybe, impossibly, it didn't. Maybe he knew something the men didn't, or felt something they never would. What is clear is this. When the enemy adjusted fire, they followed motion. For a handful of seconds, bullets chased a blur of fur and speed, not toward the men but away. The unit moved, not in confusion now, but in reaction. They crossed the open yard, reached the wall, then the trench line. Then the stairwell behind the far building. Cover, safety, silence. When the firing stopped, the men did what training required. They swept the perimeter, returned fire, flanked, cleared the position. 2 enemy soldiers were captured. 1 found dead near the bell tower. The map had been wrong, the danger real. But the dog didn't return. They searched, briefly. Called, not by name, for there had never been one, but with whistles, gestures, the half-hopeful sound men make when they don't expect an answer. They found blood, patches of fur, then nothing. No one held a funeral. No one marked the spot. But the silence spoke louder than any eulogy, not because it was unexpected, but because it wasn't. War, after all, is a taker of things. It reclaims what it once allowed. And in the end, it takes back even what it did not earn. Later, someone said it wasn't deliberate that animals don't think like that. Others disagreed, quietly. But no theory mattered. What mattered was the absence, a shape that had filled their shadow now missing from the trail. They moved on. They had to. The column advanced. Orders resumed. Radios crackled back to life. But in the days that followed, fewer rations went uneaten. The night watch felt longer, and no one stood quite as still when the wind changed direction. The war had spared him, briefly, and then it hadn't. But several villages east, a group of children would ask why one American carried a strip of torn canvas folded, kept dry, as if it meant something. They searched without orders. No one told them to go back. No one logged it. But as soon as the village was secured and the guns fell quiet, a few men broke from the column and returned across the field. It wasn't formal. No formation, no flag. Just boots in ash, moving through the smoke-smeared wreckage. the same ground they had crawled across just hours earlier. This time, upright, slower. They found him where the earth had been torn apart, near a shattered tree line just outside the blast radius of a mortar shell. The soil was churned into uneven craters, splintered roots curling like bones. There was no struggle, no confusion, just stillness, and a body turned slightly as if mid-motion. He hadn't made it far. Maybe he wasn't trying to. There was no question of intent, not among the men. They didn't argue theories. They didn't ask what an animal could know. In war, explanations were a luxury. Only outcomes mattered. And here, the outcome was undeniable. No tactical report recorded the action. No official account would note the timing, the path, the consequence. The after-action summary listed enemy resistance, minor casualties, one successful flank, nothing else. But the men stood longer than necessary. Longer than they had for men, even. Not from disrespect, but exhaustion. Emotional, moral, human. They didn't cry. They didn't pray. They just stood as if stillness might delay what they already knew. They didn't dig a regulation grave. The ground was too unstable, the supplies too scarce. Instead, one man gathered stones. Another placed a ration tin dented, familiar atop the pile. Someone else tied a strip of canvas around the base of the tree, just above the bloodline. Not a monument, a marker. There were no speeches, just silence and the weight of something they didn't have words for. War had taken thousands. It would take thousands more. But this felt different because for once, the loss wasn't commanded. It wasn't sent into fire by rank or trapped by error. It had stepped forward on its own. That, perhaps, is what stayed with them. He had no name, no number, no country. No one would notify a family. No medals would be mailed. But something had shifted. Not in the war that would go on, but in them. For months, they had learned to calculate loss in terms of function. A man was missed because his rifle was gone, because his place in formation was empty, because someone had to carry what he left behind. But this loss made no such demand. It added no burden. It offered no strategic vacuum. And yet it pressed on them harder than they expected. They continued on, of course. War didn't stop for reflection. But the silence that followed the gunfire now felt altered. Not heavier, just more honest. The kind of silence that doesn't ask for grief, but makes room for it anyway. Later that week, a replacement arrived. New boots, new face, fresh orders in hand. He asked about the extra strip of canvas tied to the side of the transport truck. No one explained, not out loud. But when they moved again, and the road ahead forked in 2-1 direct, the other slower, more covered, the men paused, checked the wind, listened, then chose the long way around. Not because a map told them to, but because once, something without a name had shown them how to move differently. No officer gave the order. No field manual described what came next. But once the last sweep was complete and the radios confirmed movement, no one returned to the transport. Instead, men stood where the earth was still loose, the smoke still fresh, waiting for something that didn't need to be said. Shovels were not requested. They were retrieved, quietly, from supply trucks and engineering kits, handed off without comment. It was not mutiny. It was not protest. It was something simpler, the kind of choice that comes when there's no rule left to follow but your own. The ground chosen lay just beyond the reach of the shelling, beneath a cluster of trees whose branches still held leaves, even this late into spring. It wasn't strategic. It wasn't symbolic. It was just away, far enough from the road that boots wouldn't trample it, close enough that someone might pass again, one day. Helmets were removed at first, out of habit, then left off entirely. It didn't feel like a funeral. And yet, it didn't feel like anything else either. The act took shape not from tradition, but from memory. Each man doing what felt right, even if he didn't know why. Someone found a plank of scrap wood in the ruins of a gate. Someone else carved it with the tip of a bayonet's slow, uncertain strokes. No name, just a date. And beneath it, the crude outline of a paw. Not sentimental, just true. There were no ranks in that moment, no salutes, no inspections. The chain of command, for all its purpose, dissolved under the weight of something heavier than protocol. A private handed a lieutenant a tool. A sergeant folded cloth beneath the mound. Eyes met, then dropped. No one corrected the breach. The ceremony lasted less than 10 minutes, long enough to matter, brief enough to be remembered. No speeches, only stillness. The kind of silence that carries more than sound, the kind that absorbs what words can't hold. When they finished, no one lingered. The war was still moving. Orders still waited. But for the first time, in days, maybe weeks, the men moved without being told, as if the rhythm had reset, as if something dislodged had clicked back into place. What they had buried wasn't just a dog. It was the question he had raised, the structure he had unsettled, the distance he had crossed, uninvited and unafraid. He hadn't belonged to them, not in the way armies use that word, but still, they had buried him as one of their own, not because of sentiment, but because no other choice would have made sense. And that may be the most remarkable detail of all. That in a war built on orders, hierarchy, and regulation, one of its most human acts happened without any of them. There would be no record, no line in the battalion log, just a patch of turned earth, a carved plank, and a group of men who would walk quieter for a while. And when the convoy resumed, and boots struck the ground in unison again, no one spoke of what had just happened. They didn't need to. But at the next crossroads, where the map split and choices returned, it was one of the youngest soldiers, a replacement barely known, who asked which way he would have taken. The funeral wasn't formal. It didn't follow regulation, didn't match any line in the field manual, but it followed instinct, the kind that had been hardened by months of blood, cold, and noise. These were men trained to move on, to bury quickly, to avoid memory. And yet they stayed, longer than needed, quieter than expected. No chaplain stood over the grave. No rifles fired into the sky. The gesture wasn't about spectacle. It wasn't even about grief, at least not in the usual sense. It was something older, a stillness that had nothing to prove. They had seen too many die to believe every death deserved ceremony. But they had also seen enough to recognize when something deserved respect. And in that moment, surrounded by the burnt-out bones of a nameless village, that respect required no explanation. Because the dog had done something every soldier understood. He had moved forward when it mattered. Not because he was told to, not because there was glory waiting, but because something in him responded to danger the way soldiers are trained to, not by avoiding it, but by entering it. That was what broke through the silence more than anything else. Not the loss, not the blood, but the decision. He hadn't been ordered, hadn't been deployed. No command had sent him. And yet, he went. That action, voluntary, instinctive, exact, was the clearest definition of service most of them would witness that year. Not a mission, not a medal, just motion toward threat, to protect others. And so the question of species fell away. The uniforms didn't matter, language didn't matter, even sides blurred, because at the center of it all was a truth few would say aloud, that in the end, service isn't about what flag you wear, it's about what you choose when no one is watching. He had chosen, and they saw that. No one in the unit had known his origin, whether he'd once belonged to a German patrol, or a family displaced, or no one at all. That history had remained locked inside his silence. But in those final days, what mattered wasn't where he came from, it was where he had stood, among them, behind them, sometimes beside them, and finally, ahead of them, when the moment turned. And that, perhaps, was the reason no one questioned the burial. Why no one objected when a corporal used his own rations to mark the spot. Why a lieutenant, who hadn't cried since the Ardennes, stared at the grave longer than protocol allowed. Because the dog hadn't asked to be included. He just acted like one of them. And then, in the end, he'd done what all soldiers fear most: crossed a line from which there is no return. Not for reward, not for orders, not even for love. Just for the quiet, irreversible act of service. Later, when replacements arrived and the war moved farther east, the memory began to fade from paper, but not from posture. A few men walked with more attention to their flanks. Others paused longer before crossing empty intersections. And one man, who would survive the war and raise a family in Indiana, would keep a photo in his footlocker of the unit, gathered loosely around a tree. At its base, a small plank of wood, barely visible. No name, just the outline of a paw, carved with a bayonet. Faint, but permanent. And if you asked him years later, he wouldn't call it a dog's grave. He'd call it a soldier's. By the spring of 1945, American soldiers no longer spoke in absolutes. Words like good and evil, once printed in newspapers and echoed in recruitment posters, had grown thin at the edges. There had been too many compromises, too many moral shortcuts taken not out of cowardice, but survival. War did not reward purity. It buried it. Innocence had vanished long before the first Allied boots crossed into Germany. It had burned in the hedgerows of Normandy, bled into the snow of the Ardennes, and been buried beneath bombed-out towns where children were still counted among the dead. By the time the war neared its end, few remembered how it had looked when it began. The enemy had changed too. At first he wore a uniform and followed rules, but by 1945 he wore hunger and desperation, and sometimes nothing at all. The enemy might be a sniper in a barn, or a boy with a stolen pistol, or a woman who smiled and pointed then vanished. Every decision now came with an aftertaste of doubt. In such a world, ethics became flexible. Not because the men wanted them to be, but because rigidity had become dangerous. Roads had to be cleared. Civilians had to be searched. Fires had to be started where maps suggested fuel. Necessary was the word most often used. Quietly, uncomfortably. Then, eventually, not at all. And then came the dog. He didn't arrive with meaning. He didn't ask for anything. But when he acted, when he ran forward into fire, without command, without promise, something shifted. In a moment when instinct was supposed to be selfish, his was not. He had not been trained for sacrifice. He had chosen it. That act, simple, unsentimental, undeniable, forced a kind of pause, not in time, but in erosion. It interrupted the steady decay of feeling the men had accepted as part of their duty. It reminded them what a choice looked like, unprompted, unclaimed, and unprotected. No one had asked him to move. No one had cleared the path, and no one could explain afterward why it mattered so much. But it did, because for once, something had happened that couldn't be attributed to orders, rank, survival, or revenge. It had simply happened, and it had been good. That recognition didn't come with comfort. It came with weight, the kind that settles on you without sound, the kind that makes a man hold his breath longer than he should, just to delay the moment he has to move again. In burying him, they weren't just honoring a life. They were protecting something fragile, something war had tried to kill in them. Not pity, not loyalty, but humanity, not as a value, but as a choice. Because by then they understood. Humanity wasn't issued in a standard kit. It couldn't be taught through drills or summoned with slogans. It had to be remembered, preserved, acted upon, even when the rules said otherwise. And so, without knowing it, they resisted. Not the enemy, not the command, but the logic that war had drilled into them, the logic that said only orders mattered, only sides defined worth, only usefulness made something deserving of life or memory. The grave was a refusal. Small, quiet, unrecorded but real. It said, "This mattered, even now." It said, not everything has to be forgotten just because it wasn't written down. And long after they left that field, long after the war ended and uniforms were folded into attic trunks, the memory stayed, not as a story told often, but as a silence that returned in moments of doubt. A few wrote it down, not in memoirs, in letters, in notebooks never published. One man mentioned it only once in a line beneath a photograph, mailed home and never discussed again. It read, "He died for us, and we buried him like one of our own. No one said we had to." And that may be the most honest sentence ever written about war, because the war had taken so much. Friends, certainty, the idea that right was always visible. But in that loss, something had also emerged, not as compensation, but as defiance. The dog reminded them that some decisions can't be justified, only felt. That some graves don't hold glory, only truth. And truth, in the end, is what remains when the noise stops, when the uniforms disappear, when the medals tarnish and the textbooks forget the names. What remains is the soil that was turned because someone believed something mattered even when no one else was watching. In that way, the grave was not an end. It was a message, etched not in stone, but in memory, unreadable to the world, but unforgettable to those who had stood there. And somewhere, in another country, under another flag, someone else might have done the same. This is not a story about sentimentality, not in the way the word is often used to soften, to sweeten, to make war look less like what it is. No, this story does not exist to cleanse the battlefield, nor to undo the brutality that shaped it. Because nothing was undone, the war continued. Villages were leveled, families scattered, soldiers bled out on roads with no names. The German surrender was still weeks away. The Pacific would burn long after Europe fell silent. The brutality was real. It remained. This was not forgiveness. The dog's grave did not absolve anyone. It did not erase the things men had done or the things they still would. It did not balance the scale. It did not try. War cannot be undone by gesture. Its weight cannot be lifted by a moment, however pure. Nor was it reconciliation. The dog's death did not bridge cultures, heal nations, or rewrite alliances. He had no known flag, no paperwork, no recorded past. The soldiers who buried him did not see him as a symbol of anything beyond the immediate. He was not a stand-in for peace. He was simply present. And then, he wasn't. It did not change the outcome of 1945. No battles were averted, no treaties moved faster, no generals revised their strategy. History marched forward at its usual pace, brutal and unbending. And in the great archive of war, the ledgers and libraries and bulletins, his name does not appear. But what this story did change was smaller and far more durable. It changed a handful of men, quietly, in a place no command structure could reach. It interrupted the erosion that war had worked so hard to complete, the slow stripping away of everything not immediately useful, the reduction of people to functions, of instinct to reaction, of memory to ash. Because the dog reminded them, not through action, but through presence, of something they had been before the uniform, and something they still hoped to be after it. Not softer, not cleaner, just human. The men did not become different people because of what happened, but for a moment, they remembered who they were when they first boarded the ship to Europe, before the frostbite, before the letters home stopped arriving, before they had learned how to ration grief, ignore children's eyes, and call silence cleared. That memory brief, unspoken, was the real outcome of this story. It did not make the war easier, but it made the return more possible. And that may be the clearest measure of what mattered. Not that a dog died, but that a group of men, worn thin by months of loss, stopped to bury him not because he was special, but because he had acted in a way that reminded them they could still choose to care. Care not as weakness, but as resistance. A refusal to let the war dictate every part of them. Because in war, the greatest theft is not life, it is identity. And the most lasting victory is not on a map, but in the mirror if, when it ends, you can still recognize what looks back. The grave didn't give them closure. That isn't what war offers. But it gave them a line in the dirt, a place where something survived. Not flesh, but meaning. And that not the dog, not the grave, not the silence, is what carried home. A handful of men, walking back toward a peace they hadn't yet trusted, remembered something true in a field where no one had expected truth to appear. Not glory, not absolution, just a decision, quiet, shared, and final, to treat someone as worth burying right. And years later, when names were forgotten, and files sealed, and monuments built for larger deeds, one of those men would tell his grandson not the story of battles, not the number of kills, but of a day when nothing changed, except everything. Because in the end, what mattered most wasn't how the war was won, but how they chose not to lose themselves within it. The unit moved on within days. There was no ceremony of departure, no final glance over the shoulder. Trucks started, boots lifted, orders resumed. The front was fluid again, and they were needed farther east. Towns were still falling. Pockets of resistance still burned. War does not pause for memory. And so, they left, quietly, as soldiers often do, carrying more than they admitted. The grave remained. It was not recorded on any official map. No coordinates logged, no names listed. In the battalion's after-action reports, the date passed like any other. Enemy fire encountered. Flank secured. 1 casualty. 2 prisoners. Weather overcast, wind from the north. No mention of what they buried beneath the tree line. But it stayed. A low mound of earth, ringed with stones, marked by a plank of splintered wood. On that wood, no name, just the outline of a paw, etched by a bayonet, soft, uneven, human. No photograph survived. None was taken. Cameras were for victory, for reunions, for things that could be told. This couldn't be. Not because it was shameful, but because it didn't fit. It didn't fit the shape of war the world would later draw clean, decisive, black and white. It didn't fit the myth of the hardened soldier, the total enemy, the redemptive end. This was something smaller. And that's why it endured. Years passed, decades. The men aged. Some returned home and never spoke of Europe again. Others wrote memoirs, or taught history, or sat quietly in American Legion halls, listening to voices that hadn't cracked in 40 years suddenly tremble when certain memories surfaced. This was one of those. Veterans recalled it not for what the dog was, but for what they had done. That was the difference. It wasn't about the animal. It was about the act, about the decision to treat someone as worthy of honor, even when every regulation said otherwise, even when the enemy had no uniform, even when no one would know. What made the grave matter wasn't its symbolism. It wasn't some grand metaphor for peace or reconciliation or the blur between sides. It was much simpler. It was the clearest proof they ever had in all the months of ruin that the war had not taken everything, that they had not lost the ability to choose rightly when no one was watching. That instinct, in its truest form, hadn't been burned out of them. That obedience hadn't erased their judgment. And maybe more importantly, that compassion, when not assigned, still emerged. There are men who never spoke of that day, not to family, not even to fellow soldiers. But when interviewed decades later in VFW halls, at kitchen tables, by local historians, with handheld tape recorders, their voices changed when the story came. It was never long, usually just a few sentences, always the same structure. There was this dog. He walked with us. He saved a few of us. We buried him. Not much more. But always followed by a silence that filled the room in a way no medal ever could. They didn't speak of strategy, or guilt, or philosophy. They didn't explain why it mattered, because they didn't need to. They had done something unrequired and unforgotten, and that's what stayed behind, not the marker, which would vanish in time to wind and moss and memory, but the choice. The moment when men, stripped down by war, proved they were not empty, that when instinct could have said, move on, it instead said, stay, dig, place, mark, even without a name, even without orders, even without knowing if they'd ever return. There are no monuments to that decision, no citations, no commemorative plaques at the edge of a German field. The war left far grander legacies, but none, perhaps, as quietly necessary. Because in the end, every war is told in numbers: dead, wounded, missing, towns taken, supplies burned, flags raised. But what matters most is often unmeasured, unnamed, unwritten. A pause, a plank of wood, a grave no one asked for, dug by those who no longer needed permission to do what was right. And somewhere, beneath the roots of a forgotten tree, that grave may still exist. Unmarked, but not unfelt,